to continue on in our series, the one that we've been doing on perspectives on John, and we are going to be talking this morning about something that we call natural theology. And then we're going to practice. So get ready. It's going to be a little different. I try to hike regularly, particularly because anything else resembling exercise seems entirely too tedious and uncomfortable. I am not one of those people that would jump on an elliptical. I don't like lifting weights. I'm not crazy about jogging because it messes up my knees. But the idea of hiking isn't so bad. Since moving to the Black Hills area, I've spent most of my hiking time on the Serenity Trail, just off of Highway 85. But I've also managed a few hikes further north on the Flying V Trail. And I've been over into South Dakota and hiked in Hell Canyon and around Jewel Cave, which are some of those are a little bit more challenging, and they encroach slightly on my no exercise rule for hiking. But honestly, I'm just trying to stay healthy and just healthy enough that I don't have to give up pastries. That's the goal. So when I went on a hike this past week to the Flying V Trail, I was just trying to stretch my legs a little bit and manage to not work too hard, but just hard enough. If I could burn off about 300 calories, I think it's worth about one donut. Now, my wife, for some strange reason, thinks that hiking is supposed to be exercise. She goes looking for places that will elevate your heart rate and stress your muscles, and just generally make you feel lousy in the name of being healthy. She seems to think that it is necessary that one should feel bad in order to feel good. Of course, as a medical professional who specializes in nutrition, I know that she's right about exercise and the aspects that lead to good health. But I'm not out there to exercise. I'm trying to do the bare minimum. So when we chose to hike at Flying V Trail this past week, she chose the trail that goes straight up. And when I say straight up, I'm not kidding. It looks like it goes just straight up the side of the hill, something at a ridiculous angle. From a distance, this looks like a beautiful area, majestic hills with evergreen forest, and riding along in the car and listening to the radio and having pleasant conversation. It's wonderful. And then whenever you get out and you start walking straight up the hill at a 45-degree angle, it becomes a completely different story. And it's entirely too close to work and effort. And if that's going to be the case, it's not going to be fun for me. Now understand, I have no problem with the idea of work, sweaty, grimy, exhausting work, but don't call it fun. Call it work. That's what it is. Don't try to convince me that I'm having an enjoyable time when I can't breathe. My lungs burn, and all I wanted to do was just go for a stroll in the evergreens. When the next opportunity arises to go hiking with my wife, however, I will go. For 3 reasons. First, I know that despite my protest, I actually need the exercise. I'm nearing 45 years old. If I don't take care of myself, the next 15 to 20 years might not be quite so much fun. Second, I love being in the woods, exercise or not. Nature is a place where I sort through stuff that runs through my mind, and so I get a lot of internal processing done. Finally, nature is a place of worship for me. It's in nature that I feel most the part of creation and find a deepest connection to God. I see God through the things that have been shaped and formed and set in motion in the natural order of things. And that brings us to our perspective for this morning. The perspective of natural theology. Now, natural theology is simply theology that has not been revealed to us by divine revelation, meaning it hasn't come to us through the Bible. It also hasn't come to us through the church or through the church traditions. It is the truth of God that we come to find using things like sensation and reason and science. It is theology that is practiced in and through the mind and perceptions of the individual as they try to answer questions like, what does the word God mean? Does God exist? Do we have free will if God does exist? And doing so without drawing claims from sacred texts or divine revelation, even if we personally hold those claims to be true. It is seeking God with our natural intellectual faculties without the use of the Bible or traditions or teachings. Now, this kind of thinking about and questioning of God is nothing new. It goes back to the ancient Greek philosophers. The earliest idea of theology had to do not with thinking about a Jewish or Christian God, but thinking about the lives and activities of Greco-Roman gods and divinities. Thinkers like Plato and Aristotle and other Greek philosophers asked questions about the nature of the universe and referred to it as metaphysics. While this was taking place in ancient Greece, the Israelite people began to develop a tribal and then corporate identity around the being that the people referred to as Adonai. Eventually, a group splintered off of Judaism around the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and began its own quest to define itself with regard to what theology was and how Greek theology intersected with that, or Greek philosophy intersected with that. From the Christian perspective, much of the thinking about God that goes into natural theology has been influenced by Greek philosophy, particularly the works of Plato and Aristotle. During the time of the early church fathers, the idea of theology was a difficult term because of this poetic way that the Greeks used the word. The term philosophy was sometimes seen as Greek rather than Christian. Eventually, St. Augustine made the distinction between revealed theology, which is held by faith, and natural theology, which he said was understood by reason. Augustine saw the written text of the Judeo-Christian faith as those things which were revealed, and those things which were thought about God in the human mind were considered to be natural theology. Now, the early church fathers, Anselm and Aquinas, continued this conversation in a more robust way with very specific lines of thought. Both tried to prove the existence of God, not using the Bible. Anselm used a particular kind of argument that was based on logic and laws of non-contradiction, and Aquinas by defining two different kinds of truth. One which can be reasoned and one which is beyond our ability to reason. This continued on with theologians and philosophers. Men like Kierkegaard and Hume and Kant and Paley, they continued to expound and to build on these ideas until the time of Darwin in the 19th century. Now, at this point, natural theology became a part of a discussion on the evolutionary process, and it was wrapped up in what we call now modern apologetics. It wasn't until the end of the 20th century that theologians and philosophers started asking questions of natural theology again without trying to debate about the existence of God, although they continue to do so and ask questions and defenses as part of that conversation. Typically, it's now seen as a philosophy of religion. And thinkers, men like Alvin Plantinga and John Hick and others, take up the mantle of this 3,000-year tradition of thinking about God. Now, as I was considering what I might do for an application this week, how do you apply something like this, where we wonder about the nature of God without using the Bible? I thought about how are we going to use this as a lens to look at a biblical text? It almost seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? It almost seems contradictory to say we're going to look at the Bible to not look at the Bible. It's very strange sounding. But I think this can be done, and I think it can be done as an exercise. So guess what? This sermon just became interactive. Where are our ushers for the morning? Do we have ushers for this morning? We've got one in the corner over there. We've got a volunteer usher. Yes? Can I get you to stand up, please? And can I get another usher? Do we have another usher that could volunteer to ush? Please. That way we've got a microphone on either side of the room. So here's our exercise for this morning. Plan is this. I'm going to reread the text that we just read at the beginning of this sermon. And here's what I'd like for you to do. I want you to look for questions to ask about how we see God in the natural world presented in the text. I want you to look for questions to ask that are questions that would be the sort of thing that would, let's see how to put this. They would be the sort of questions that you would ask to see God outside of the Bible. Questions of reason and logic. I'll give you some samples at the end, but first, I just want you to listen to the text. And I want you to listen to it as a natural theologian. And I want you to begin thinking of your questions. After this, Jesus went across the Galilee Sea, that is, the Tiberias Sea. A large crowd followed him because they had seen the miraculous signs he had done among the sick. Jesus went up a mountain and sat there with his disciples. It was nearly time for Passover, the Jewish festival. Jesus looked up and saw the large crowd coming toward him. He asked Philip, "Where will we buy food to feed these people?" Jesus said this to test him, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, "More than half a year's salary worth of food wouldn't be enough for each person to have even a little bit." One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said, "A youth here has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that for a crowd like this?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass there. They sat down, about 5,000 of them. Then Jesus took the bread. When he had given thanks, he distributed it to those who were sitting there. He did the same thing with the fish, each getting as much as they wanted. When they had plenty to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover pieces so that nothing will be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves that had been left over by those who had eaten. When the people saw that he had done a miraculous sign, they said, "This is truly the prophet who is coming into the world." Jesus understood that they were about to come and force him to be their king. So he took refuge again alone on a mountain. When evening came, Jesus' disciples went down to the lake. They got into a boat and were crossing the lake to Capernaum. It was already getting dark and Jesus hadn't come to them yet. The water was getting rough because a strong wind was blowing. When the wind had driven them out for about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the water. He was approaching the boat. They were afraid. He said to them, "I am. Don't be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and just then the boat reached the land where they had been heading. The next day, the crowd that had remained on the other side of the lake realized that only one boat had been there. They knew Jesus hadn't gone with his disciples, but the disciples had gone alone. Some boats came from Tiberias, near the place where they had eaten the bread over which the Lord had given thanks. When the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and came to Capernaum looking for Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" So, what are some of the questions that come to mind with regard to this sermon. I'm going to give you a chance to think about this passage of Scripture and what are the questions that you might have about the natural world or natural theology, and how those questions of reason and logic might intersect with this passage of Scripture. Does anybody have a question? Go ahead. We've got a few. All right, hands up already. Excellent. Very good.
When she read through this scripture the first time, this came out to me right away when she read it again. And I thought it was kind of a different response. Okay, when you, yeah, I heard it. Okay. When I heard the scripture the first time, I noticed this. And then he reads it again. So I'm going to ask you about this. I thought it was a strange response. And why would Jesus respond this way? Gosh, I can't even read my writing. Okay, they came came searching for him, and they were going to force him to be king. So he took off. I thought that was kind of an interesting take. I mean, a lot of people want power or be king, but he didn't want anything to do with that, I guess, or he wouldn't have took off. That's my question. Why would he respond that way?
Why would Jesus act the way that he did when they wanted to make him king? That's a good question. That's a good natural theology question. That asks a question about Jesus as a human being. And makes us stop and think, now why would Jesus as a human being avoid that? So that's a good question. Other questions? Because the idea of natural theology is to come up with a question. Answering that question would take a long time. But we want to ask good questions, and that's what we're trying to do here this morning. So what's another question? What's another question? Yes?
I would go back to the beginning of the scripture and ask why all these people were so interested in him and why did they follow him?
Why were they interested? Why did they follow? What is this human being in there?
Hungry.
They were hungry. I don't know if there was a buffet sign out, Homer. Other questions? Other questions, other thoughts of questions? Well, I've got a few questions here that might kickstart this. So here's some questions that came to mind for me that I think are natural theology questions that maybe they'll kickstart some ideas for you. So how about a couple? What does it mean for something to be a miracle? I mean, we just read two passages, two miraculous things that have happened. The feeding of the 5,000 and all that went into that, and Jesus walking on the water. What do miracles say about how we think about God, how we think about Jesus and who he was? The second question has to do with the idea of miracles, and that is, how does God act in relation to nature and the natural world? What does God do, or what do we do when we come across something where it seems like God is breaking the laws of the natural world as he set them up? What do we do with questions like that? Any other questions? Do those help to kickstart any questions or bring to mind anything else? All right. Well?
We have one.
Oh, good. Yeah.
When I was a little guy, right after the rainstorm, a rainbow showed up. And so I asked Mom, I said, where did that come from? And she said that was God's promise for tomorrow. That was pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, and those kind of questions. Why does the natural world behave the way it does? It's a great. It's funny because those are the questions that children ask reflexively, and it's a great It's a great thing to go back and remember what it is to be a child and ask those questions. I've got a couple of other questions here that I wrote down too. What does it mean for Jesus to defy the natural order of things? What kind of healing is talked about in the beginning of the chapter? Is it physical? Is it spiritual? When it says that Jesus had healed many, was he healing their bodies or their spirits, their minds? What does that mean? Any other questions? Any other thoughts? One more, down front.
The Bible says, in the beginning, God created
Hang on.
the heavens and the earth.
Can you start again?
And we,
Can you start
in
again?
the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then what did he want to do with it? He had to think of something. And he started with things that grow. And then he added animals. And then finally he added people. And that's the way I see it.
Well, there you are. So this process of natural theology is a process of thinking about the things that we see in Scripture and asking these kinds of questions about the world around us. And how does this world engage with these ideas in Scripture? How do we use the logic and the reason, the faculties that God gave us to reconcile these things that we read in Scripture? My challenge to you is this, that this become an introductory exercise, as all of these perspectives are, in ways in which you might begin to look at the Scriptures and see them as being words that point to questions, that they might bring up an inquisitive nature in you, that you might go out from this place and be the kind of people that wonder about God. That's my prayer for you. That's my prayer for us as we close this sermon.